So, Patrick, great to see you again.
Yeah, great to see you again as well.
We got together last time just to kind of have a general conversation. We were especially wanting to focus on some of the kind of historical origins of Holacracy, Sociocracy 3.0, looking back at Sociocracy itself, and the main kind of focus of our conversation was looking at the common ground. Looking at the fact that there's a lot of different methodologies, frameworks, approaches coming up right now, but in some ways, more or less, they're all kind of coming from some similar origins, and they're all kind of steering towards the same kind of overall outcomes, which is toward organizations that are more effective and organizations that are more nourishing for the people who are involved in them, and kind of coming back around to the underlying fact that organizations actually are one of our strategies as human beings to meet our needs as a species. And people are turning to approaches like Holacracy or patterns from S3 in the hope that that's going to help in some way. Yeah. And then we said, let's get together for another call to get into more, well, we said that more contentious topics. And I'm not sure actually what the more contentious topics are, but I know that I'm coming with some questions today and areas I'd like to kind of unpack a bit with you, especially because of your expertise in Holacracy. I think you're going to be able to bring some insight and perspectives to some of the areas that are less clear for me. And also maybe a couple of kind of common claims or repeating topics that come up in conversations elsewhere about Holacracy and S3. And I thought maybe we could also dig into those a little bit and see if we can make some sense of what's going on there as well. Yeah, so how about you? Where are you coming from today? What are you bringing to the call?
Yeah, I think for me it was also very important to kind of start that conversation, or well, now with what is now becoming a series of conversation, it seems, basically with firm footing in my belief that there's way more common ground than there's difference, and somehow there seems to be in many areas in our current world there seems so many of these battles where we battle about the 5% difference when actually we have 95% shared interests, needs, and things that unite us. However, something in our in the wiring of our brain seems to predispose us to look at these differences. Somehow these seem to be much more interesting to us. And I can find that within myself, definitely. I like, picking apart the differences because there's new insights to be gained, right? Looking at that. And I think at the same time, while I enjoy doing this, and I'm very much looking forward to doing this with you today, but for me, it was also important to just be very clear that, yeah, there's just so much common ground, and I think that, like you said, the generator function basically underlying the emergence of these different frameworks or practices. I think understanding those is crucial to understand, well, we're not talking about completely different phenomenon and one is better than the other. They're all addressing the same basic things, basically. Their starting point, their point of origin was probably different, and that's why they arrived at slightly different perspectives and slightly different practices. But there's a large space of commonality, and I think having clarity about that and exploring the commonality and the underlying, the undercurrents, basically. I think that was really important for me to lay that out in our first conversation. And I've been I've been interested in Sociocracy 3.0 for a couple of years now, and I by no means would consider myself an expert, but I've again and again, you know, looked at the evolution of the patterns and everything that you're creating, and I've continuously been impressed with the breadth and the depth of the content you guys put out, and again and again I've had some questions about how do you deal with X and how do you deal with Y, and why do you do it like this, because this is something that from my perspective is very important, or a huge asset in the holacracy practice, and I don't see how this is addressed in S3. And so I have these few questions that I'm very much looking forward to exploring with you today.
Sounds great. Okay. Well, one thing I think is important to make clear for anyone who's new to this conversation, because one fundamental difference between holacracy and S3 is the fact that holacracy is a framework. The Sociocratic circle method is a framework. Sociocracy was a kind of idea of a new way of government in its earliest kind of iteration. And S3 is a menu of patterns. And I know we've covered this in the other conversations, but I think that's really crucial for people to understand, because this whole idea of comparing S3 to holacracy, you know, if people don't appreciate that difference, then they're going to lump S3 in with being yet another kind of framework or methodology for organizations. And so the fact that, you know, you can construct the Sociocratic circle method with patterns from S3, and you can also construct holacracy, you can grow something that looks like holacracy out of S3, is just a fundamental difference. So in a way, there's nothing to say about it other than just to acknowledge the fact that that's so. So the whole conversation about which one's better in terms of S3 or holacracy is a false path. Mm-hmm. The question around the approach of using a framework, you know, or a kind of patterns-based approach, that's a worthwhile conversation, I think. And we touched on this a bit last time in terms of the pros and cons of each of those. And maybe our conversation will go into that again today. But I just wanted to make that expressly clear to people. We're not going to have that kind of conversation because it just doesn't make sense. And it's one of the unique value propositions of S3, I think, as much as one of the unique value propositions of holacracy is we offer a kind of whole system framework to get started with, yeah? Whereas S3 offers this menu-based, like pull-in as needed approach. Mm-hmm. So with that said, I'm curious, maybe we can start in from your side. I guess you've given some thought to the questions and maybe the order of them. So how about you kind of jump in first? Either questions or topics that you'd like to dig into today, and let's start somewhere and see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as one does sometimes with these things, I kind of wondered about the beginning, about the origin, and maybe my apologies if you have laid this out in great detail elsewhere. I didn't do a lot of research, but I haven't also found anything. But I would be really curious to hear a bit more about the origin story of S3, particularly. I think I don't imagine a James a couple of years ago sitting somewhere nice and suddenly having Eureka! I'm just going to create this plethora of patterns to kind of help the world organize better. I mean, probably we're aware of many of the things there are out there, and yet obviously you saw a lack, or you saw an untapped potential in what was available that kind of gave you the impetus to start something new, right? And I would be very curious about this origin story of what led you to set out to basically create what would become S3.
Okay, well, it's true that there are sources out there with the origin story, although I couldn't name off the top of my head exactly where people could look for that. You can also check out in the beginning of the practical guide, in the introductory section, we lay out a bit of explanation around that as well. But I'll see if I can do it in a brief way. So I was introduced to Sociocracy as a kind of concept back in 2001. With the proposition that it was something worthwhile learning that would help me in my work with a community of people with a business attached at the time who were in conflict, and I was supporting those people to navigate that conflict. And my kind of sponsor for that invited me to also learn about sociocracy and nonviolent communication at the same time. So I'd never heard of sociocracy, but I looked into it, and over 2 years, with a very minimal understanding of it, because there was only a single web page in English on the web at that point, and I had a hand-typed document from Australia explaining the Sociocratic Circle method. It really helped us turn things around in this organization. I was impressed by that, and I thought probably I'll do something with this for the rest of my life. That was kind of my conclusion. Anyway, fast forward to around 2008, I started to put more energy into being an advocate for the Sociocratic Circle method. I did that very much on my own terms. I wasn't particularly connected to the Sociocracy group in the Netherlands. I did make attempts to connect with them, and to be honest, I wasn't very impressed with how I was met by them. I was quite surprised and disappointed by some of that, and I'm on the record saying that. Mainly, I think, because of the kind of a preciousness around the Sociocratic Circle method and a wish to ensure kind of integrity. And, you know, so they have a clear certification program. And if you're not certified, then it's very hard to get any sort of recognition. And that's a kind of problem that we can come back to, because I think the whole topic of certification, licensing, and so on is an interesting one. So fast forward, by 2014, I was the most booked sociocracy trainer in the world that year, mainly working in nonprofit sector, teaching the Sociocratic Circle method. And I was a theoretical advocate for it with some experience. And obviously over time, I gained more experience. And then in mid 2014, I met Bernard Bockelbrink in a workshop where I was introducing the Sociocratic Circle method, hosted by Lily David. So the three of us were in the same room for the first time in June 2014, I think. Bernard attended the workshop. He came to another one the next day that he'd not planned to come. And his background was in tech as a software developer. He worked in a CTO role, and he was looking at the Sociocratic Circle method as having utility for helping solve this problem of bringing a more kind of agile approach to the whole organizational system, because he saw the investment into agile operations, but the issue of bringing that agility and leanness to how a whole system functions was missing, in his opinion. So he went away for a few months, wrote to me with a link to his webpage, something called the Sociocracy Remix Kit. And in there, he'd started to put together resources synergizing sociocratic ideas with agile and lean, with the view to providing a set of free resources to the tech community to help them understand more and learn about this. So I saw that. I was really impressed and curious about his experiences with agile and lean. It was a field that I had very little experience in. And I was also concerned about some of his interpretations of sociocracy. So I said, I'll get on a plane and come and see you, and we'll spend a week together and work together on this resource. So the kind of the original motivation was to create free learning resources for people to be able to kind of learn about these things and have a better time in organization than they were having that day. So fast forward, we got together for a week with a backlog. By the end of the week, there was like 6 times as many things in the backlog. So I came back a month or so later, we realized that we were stumbling on something more than we'd imagined to start with, or the potential for something more. But the crucial moment was during that second visit. Bernard asked me, can you tell me, James, of how many organizations that you introduced to the Sociocratic Circle method, or other organizations you know that have been using that, have stayed kind of true to the rigor of the Sociocratic Circle method over time? And my personal answer to that question was none. So he asked me what I observed, and I said, well, what I observe is over time, they keep what they think works. They change things that they think would benefit from being changed, and they throw out things or just drop things that they don't think are valuable. And I'm not discounting the fact there aren't some cases of organizations in the world, perhaps, who are true to the book with the Sociocratic Circle method, but honestly, there's not many, because for better or worse, people just synergize that with other things they know and do. And that's what people do. So he said, well, if that's the case, why don't we help people do that instead? Why don't we break down these different frameworks and methods that people kind of jump into bed with, and look for those underlying patterns that we can find throughout them, and see if we can make sense of those for ourselves and describe them in a way as clearly as possible, that other people would have the opportunity to investigate those patterns. And I mean like behavior patterns, it's like guidelines and processes that you can see being applied in human collaboration that are useful in some context. And that's how S3 was born. Yeah.
That's interesting. So what what immediately jumps out at me is that there's another commonality, because what I heard you describing was that you basically you found something in the Sociocratic Circle method that on the one hand you found extremely valuable, and it brought something to the world that was really beneficial, and at the same time you encountered some problems, some ways to make it better, to improve it, right? And I don't want to speak for Brian Robertson here, but I think that resonates very, very much with the story that I've heard him share about the origins of Holacracy, right? So and we can link to he wrote a pretty nice article as well about the origin story of Holacracy, and he also started out at Ternary Software back then, using Sociocratic Circle method for a while. And also found it brought in many useful elements, and it was missing some of the key elements that he was looking for at the time, basically to achieve this power shift that he was looking for within his company, and so that seems to be another commonality around how these two different approaches evolved.
Yeah, well, I think it is to a point, but maybe there's some subtlety and nuance there as well that we could unpack a bit. So, number one, it wasn't that we saw a way to make the Sociocratic Circle method better. Mm-hmm. I think the Sociocratic Circle method as a system is great, mm-hmm. but it's only relevant in certain contexts some of the time. Mm-hmm. Right. So Gerard Endenberg developed it in Endenberg Electrotechnique. And at the time that made sense in his context. Yep. The problem with it is, and this is where I come back to the preciousness thing from the Sociocracy group, is, endorsing a specific methodology that can't move, mm-hmm. is going to sooner or later become limiting in certain contexts. And in others, it's just going to be largely irrelevant to people, mm-hmm. for a myriad of reasons. But it's not that we tried to make the Sociocratic Circle method better. Mm-hmm. It was just that we saw a problem with any specific large-scale method, mm-hmm. or framework at all, right? It's like looking at the limits of that. And I have the same kind of critique of Holacracy too. It's like, and we can get into the evolution now towards a more modular approach, and we can also see the advantages, but it's only going to it's a shoe that's going to fit certain people some of the time, right? But you can't say, well, something else is better in terms of a different framework or method. What we can look at is application. It's like, okay, what do we do with this thing? How do we use this thing? And how adaptable is it to our needs? And how much do we need to adapt to accommodate it? And are those adaptations on balance more valuable or more costly, right? The other thing about the origin story of Holacracy, and I know Brian's story well, but I also know the story from the Sociocracy side as well, you know, and how that evolved. So Brian saw the limitations of the Sociocratic circle method because it's only a governance methodology, right? So that was a key thing. Historically speaking, there's a lot of common threads from the Sociocratic circle method's approach to governance and organizational structure and so on, baked into Holacracy. It's pretty much the same thing, you know, in terms of a double-linked hierarchy. I think one of the problems Brian bumped into was the fact that Sociocracy's been around a long time, right? As a concept, 170 years or so, and as a methodology, like 50 years. So that a lot of people have looked at that and made it their own somehow. And I think some people interpret the Sociocratic circle method in a manner that's more leaning towards kind of, it's quite strongly egalitarian or strong egalitarian influence, which can tend to kind of lean a bit heavily towards a more consensus and consent approach, I think, to decision making. And I think that in combination with the preciousness of the Sociocracy group and all of these kind of rules about who can do what and tell who what and what is and isn't a Sociocratic circle method, was probably just annoying for Brian, like it was for me as well. You know. And the last thing I want to say on this, and this I think is quite crucial, Brian's on the record a few times of making this what I think is a very low resolution and unfortunate distinction between Sociocracy and Holacracy. He says Sociocracy is great more for communities of people, you know, who want to kind of consider everybody's point of view and so on, but Holacracy is good for business. You know, it's good for businesses because it's focused, it's quick, it's effective. You don't get bottlenecked by people having long conversations and considering everybody's point of view, you know. And certainly there are people who apply ideas from Sociocracy that would generate an environment that looks similar to the one I think Brian's warning about there. But the Sociocratic circle method in its original form, how it was intended to be applied, if you read the norms, which are difficult to see because they're copyrighted and I don't even know where to find them anymore, but like the rules of the Sociocratic circle method, it was actually a pretty rigorous and tight process with quite like high bar for qualifying objections and so on and so forth. So I think it's an unfair comparison, you know, to just kind of ballpark anything Sociocracy in that category of only good for communities, because the fundamentals of the Sociocratic circle method in the right context are extremely relevant for businesses too.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's actually one of the things that I intended to explore a bit further. And I think, yeah, it's this notion that it's more suited towards community. I've had this thought in my head as well, and I was wondering, like, why do I get this idea? And I think in a community, you know, it's about individual people living together, and it's really clear we need a way to organize, but it's clear that it's about the people and organizing the people and the people's needs is very front and center, right? And in an organization, and I think that's something that's probably, and the way I understand you know, how Brian's looking at this, I think he probably would be very much on board with this. But I think what Holacracy brings in for me is that it makes a differentiation. It doesn't say, well, the needs of the people are irrelevant. It says, well, okay, there's an organization, and the organization has its own needs, right, to express its purpose. And then there are people filling roles on behalf of the organization, and of course, these people have needs as well. And let's add something. Let's be very aware and mindful that it's very hard to keep these two things separate, right? It's especially in the heat of the moment. Sometimes we are emotional beings, and every time we become emotional, there's a very high likelihood that we just act out whatever is present for us at that moment. And in these moments, I think it's very. I noticed that for myself still after many years of practice. I really value this, having this scaffolding that helps me remember, oh, okay, let's tune into this feeling for a moment and see, what is it exactly? What is my stuff, and how am I expressing a role here with this statement? Am I speaking from role? Am I really trying to serve the needs of the organization here as an agent of the organization? Or am I just talking for myself, Patrick, and my own needs? And both are equally valid. The question is just like, okay, what's the right context to express those different needs, right? And I think that's one of the big contributions that the Holacracy practice is making, helping us, providing a scaffolding via the governance process, and also the differentiation between role and person, to help us become aware of that. And that's it's a continuous process to kind of to learn that, and it's like training a muscle, right? You're never finished becoming fit. If you stop doing it, your muscles, they atrophy, they become weaker. So you have to keep on practicing for that to work. But it's very, very helpful if you have a structure that helps you do the reps properly, right? And helps you become aware. Well, there are these two different polarities, kind of to look at to look at a given fact from. And so I think that for me, that's one of the key distinctions that I would make. And I would be curious to hear, and I've talked also to Ted Rao, and he made the same comment you made, that in a mature sociocratic community or organization, you have that element. You have people making the distinction between, okay, is this, with an objection, are you speaking from, is this your personal objection, or you're objecting from a role? But there doesn't seem to be, or I'm not aware of any like supporting structures in the practice that kind of force you to acknowledge that. So in Holacracy, if I make an objection that's not from a role, we throw it out. We say, well, okay, then it's not a valid objection here in this governance space, because here we're looking at the needs of the organization and to improve the organization and its governance. And if you have a personal objection, then, well, that's perfectly valid, but this is not the space to address it, right? And I'm wondering, like, how can you, so one of my questions that I've carried with me is, how do you prevent this tendency that sometimes we tend to hold the organization hostage through our own personal needs, and very often in an involuntary way. It's not that we do this intentionally, but very often it's unconsciously and unintentionally, but it still happens.
Okay, well, you covered quite a lot of points there. I made a note of the holding orgs hostage on the basis of personal needs, and I'd like to come back to that. But firstly, I want to say why I think the conclusion you're sharing looks like that, but also why it's not true. So if you look at the historical use of the Sociocratic circle method, largely speaking, it's been applied like in a more whole system way in communities of people, kind of social movements and so on, than in any other client group. And there's probably a number of reasons why that is, but a couple of conclusions I have is, one, people in those kinds of communities for decades now have been quite motivated around the idea of bringing more people centricity into those kinds of situations. And if you look at communities generally, like the area they struggle most is around organizational management, right? They often have like tons of processes for processing interpersonal stuff. And there's a big focus on community glue. I'm quoting Diana Leaf Christian's conclusions around 3 elements for a thriving community here, like clear processes, community glue, and organizational management. And she observed that because most communities fail, most startups fail. And she observed in communities, if you had those 3 elements in place and were well accounted for, then there was a much higher level of success or potential for success. But organizational management was a big blind spot there. So it makes sense that communities have been looking outside of themselves for answers around how to manage themselves as organizations, because it's not really baked in, you know? Whereas if you look at a business, then the focus is on how we're going to manage the business from the start. Yeah. And, you know, you hope for strong community glue, and you maybe more or less focus on processes for interpersonal issues, you know, depending on the organization and its values, because a lot of organizations historically have been able to say, to hell with the people anyway, you know, if you don't like it, piss off and we'll find somebody else. And, you know, so just get on with things, please, and fall into suit with the organizational management. And this is why we have such high levels of disengagement in organizations and all of the kind of problems that come from that. But my point is that, on the other side, the Sociocratic circle method, in my opinion, as a whole system method, is just not good enough for most businesses. It's just like, it's too rigid. It's just like, and I think Holacracy the same. It's just too rigid. It's like, okay, nice ideas, but can't you loosen that up? It's like there's many ways to structure organizations. Really, you need to double link all the time. You need to have a lead link all of the time, or in SCM, an operational leader. You know, there's a myriad of reasons why it gets pushback, because it doesn't make sense in many contexts to people. And even if it might make sense, it doesn't make sense to the people, and therefore it doesn't get adopted. So there's a bias towards adoption, or at least experimentation, within communities and nonprofit groups, right? Or socially orientated groups. Now, one of the reasons why you then see a kind of hijacking of the system according to personal needs is, who's the customer in a community, right? The members are the customers in a community. So when a customer says, hey, I've got a problem with this organization, it's not meeting my needs, then of course that's going to be, it's going to have higher status as an argument than in an organization where you might say, well, maybe you want to go in somewhere else, right? If it's not where you want to be, you see? So you've got a bias towards community adopting the Sociocratic circle method, and then you've got a bias of those people then needing to kind of hack the Sociocratic circle method to accommodate the fact that they're their own customers. And then, of course, you create a historical story of the Sociocratic circle method being applied in quite kind of human-centric ways, with all of the problems that brings in terms of people being their own customers. Because how do you, if you're in a living community, for example, and someone objects to the room, the common room being painted pink, and it's like, okay, really? It's like, are you serious? Are we really going to have that conversation? But it's like, well, I come in this common room every day, you know, and I've got issues with pink that go way back to my childhood, maybe, you know, and it's like, oh, we're going to have to deal with that. And communities are the most difficult of organizations, right? Because it's your fundamental being is tied up in it in terms of your security, your stability. It's like your home, your belonging, the people, your family. It's like it's such a vulnerable, difficult space. Yeah. So this is why I think there's a common misconception around the Sociocratic circle method, because the main examples are it's been applied in those kinds of contexts, and there's very few examples, relatively speaking, of that being applied in business, because it's just not good enough for business, right? It's not flexible enough, it's not adaptable enough. So I'd like to then come around to S3. This was one of the problems we wanted to solve, because it's a very frustrating experience to have a process hijacked on the basis of people's like bias toward their personal needs, when that's like jeopardizing the whole. And it's a very difficult balance to strike, right? And every organization does it differently. Like we care more about the people, we care less about the people. We're more focused on the business, we're less focused on the business. And kind of every system needs to position somewhere. But with S3, we were looking at this problem and looking at if you look at the literature around the Sociocratic circle method, it is pretty clear on what qualifies as an objection, which is basically an argument that demonstrates proceeding in a certain way stands in the way of our ability to respond to a need of the organization, or my personal ability to continue doing what I've contracted with you to do, right? In terms of my role. No different to holacracy in that sense. One of the ambiguities, I think, around the Sociocratic circle method, on top of the problems of the context in which it's generally adopted, is this leaning towards vision. So the Sociocratic circle method says you clarify an inspiring vision, a dreamed of, desired future, imagined as if it's now, and then you define a mission, which is the big picture, how you'll go about turning this future into a reality. And then you have different aims, which is really deliverables, and you distribute the work of producing those aims among the people. The problem with that is, firstly, generally, it seems to me that what we envision the future should look like and how the future does look is two quite different things. And people can get fixated on their ideas around what the world should be like, and the whole effort of the organization starts to orientate in that direction and loses focus on the here and now, like what's actually happening in the world that matters to us, and what have we decided is needed that we created this organization to respond to, and how do we interact with the now in an effective way, and then discover the future that wants to emerge, right? So I'm saying this because that leads to the concept of driver, which I think is a unique value proposition in S3. Yeah. Driver, the motive for responding to a situation. Every organization has a primary driver. There's a reason why it exists. Something's happening that matters to somebody somewhere, and there's an idea around what's needed. And then the organization synergizes time, energy, and resources to create value. Yeah. That then leads towards outcomes that are meaningful to the people who are involved. So in S3, if you look at objections now, you look at drivers firstly. So how do you discover new drivers? Well, whenever you perceive a situation that looks like it could harm the organization if you don't respond to it, or benefit the organization if you do, that situation immediately qualifies as a relevant driver for the organization to consider and prioritize. Then when it comes to how you respond to drivers, you've got the topic of consent decision making and objection. And the question of what qualifies as an objection is any argument that demonstrates the potential for unintended consequences you'd rather avoid. So you can't always say for sure you're going to get those outcomes, but if you do a kind of risk versus cost analysis, right? Then you might say, well, it's a low probability, but damn, if that happens, we're going to be in big trouble. So we don't want to take that risk. Or on the other side, an argument that demonstrates a worthwhile way to improve things. And of course, you need to qualify worthwhile. But my point is, the objections are qualified in the context of organizational drivers. You're basically saying, I have an argument that shows how if we proceed like this, it risks impeding flow of value to an existing organizational driver that we've acknowledged as important. It's not about the people in that sense, right? It's about the organization.
Yeah.
And the last thing on this, I know it's quite a long explanation, but I didn't know how to say it shorter because there's a lot to cover. Going back to that, where the organization kind of sets its center of gravity between the people versus organization pole, this is where your values come in, right? It's like you've got your inherent values that you just can't help expressing. So if you look at an organization, if you interact with an organization for a while, you can kind of get a general overall feel of some of the values that this organization kind of expresses and lives by. There's a lot of diversity when you break it down and you go into individual departments and different areas of a system. But, you know, a kind of a terrorist organization has quite different values to, well, actually, I was going to say, to come some kind of social movement for social justice these days, but I think sometimes these two kind of these days look quite the same.
Laugh again, right?
Yeah, exactly. Bad example, but you get my point. But values adds another dimension of consideration when it comes to qualifying objections, right? Because, you know, someone might present an argument and say, hey, whilst logically speaking, this proposition makes sense for us, you know, it's going to be profitable and blah, blah, blah. It's going to lead to like the death of a few million people. And actually, even though that doesn't concern us directly, that's not a good idea, you know, because we value the sovereignty and divinity of life, for example, right? So agreeing on values, or at least making your values explicit and looking at which ones you have and which you aspire towards, like energizing more within the system, is how you start to clarify the ethical parameters for action within a system. And then the drivers themselves define the kind of objective parameters for action, because these are the situations you're responding to in order to be able to deliver value to the primary driver of the organization as a whole. So you can't hold people hostage through personal needs if you're playing the game of consent in an organization where there's an understanding of what qualifies as an objection, right? It's about the business, the organization, whatever you're doing. But then the values element adds in this human part as well. And you could have an organization that's playing the game of holacracy, but if they kind of lean toward the human side too much, it's going to influence what people kind of qualify as objection, right? Well, is it? I'm not sure about that. That's maybe a conversation that we can get into, but I think I'll leave it there for now. It's a misunderstanding to think that the Sociocratic circle method, or S3, is favoring people's needs over the organization. Both were designed.
That's not what I was trying to say, right? So just to make that clear, it's just my question was, is it more vulnerable to that because it doesn't have explicit structural support to prevent that from happening? Right, so I don't think that S3 or Sociocratic circle method is favoring the needs of the people over, you know, the needs of the organization. I'm just wondering, how does it address the potential of that happening, knowing that we are, you know, emotional beings, and that sometimes our emotions tend to have us, then not we them. And in Holacracy, we have very specific supporting structures that help us become aware of that, and that kind of also put us in put this in place, with our in a specific context, namely the governance of the organization when that shows up, right? That was basically the core of my question.
Got it. Yeah, and I think that's a fair point. I mean, that was the problem Brian tried to solve by nailing down objections and defining them in what he thought would be a clearer way. And I think it does that. It compromises on the principle of consent and equivalence, I think, by doing so, which are two kind of fundamental principles in sociocracy. But I understand, I'm sympathetic to why he might do that. And certainly, one of the problems with the Sociocratic circle method, despite its kind of rigidity on the one hand, is that it's largely interpreted by people through their own lens anyway, and going back to that problem I laid out, because there's such a preponderance of people within communities using it, you've got the problem that the Holacracy wouldn't work in a community, right? I've known many communities that experimented with Holacracy and they ditched it because it didn't accommodate this issue of we're our own customer as well, So actually what some communities did is they split the business from the community, and then they ran the business with Holacracy and they ran the community with the Sociocratic circle method. But none of them carried on with either over time. They just kind of adapted things and developed their own kind of synergy. So I think it's an advantage of Holacracy to a point. But it probably comes with its own costs and downsides as well. I'm hesitating because I see there's a whole nother area of conversation there around consent, objections. What are they? What's the value of a consent-based approach to decision-making versus the Holacracy's approach to decision-making? But maybe we shouldn't go there right now, but we should make a note of it to come back to it at some point. I think it's an important conversation to have.
Yeah. So what that brings up for me is also I mean, you described this very nicely, right? In a community, people are their own customers, right? And I think very often in an organization, one of the challenges to address or to be aware of is that we have, especially in a traditional conventional organization, to a large degree, we also have this fusion of identity and title, or I am a software engineer, I am a manager, I am a creative person, and so on and so forth, right? And I think that's totally understandable. That's just that's a completely normal developmental stage to be at, to be fused kind of with this let's say social construct, right? Be it I'm a member of a country, or I'm a member of this professional group, right? So this gives us stability. It gives us identification. It helps us understand what's right and wrong, and how to act in the world and still be connected to other people. So it's a very useful thing to have, right? And at the same time, of course, it has its limitation. You get to the point where it becomes limiting, where it's becoming increasingly important to not to kind of, it's just, we talked about this in the first conversation, right? Holding these paradoxes, right? Not to collapse the paradox to one side or the other, but to transcend and include the paradox, and basically looking at it from a broader perspective. And I think this is one of the most important things that I think organizations need to solve, need to provide, need to have an answer for. How can the organization and the organizational processes and structures, how can they help people evolve, right? Grow and mature, without without the whole thing becoming oppressive, right? So there's of course there's a dangerous boundary to keep a focused eye on, not to cross, because this can also become very oppressive very quickly. You need to develop, right? And then we're in a whole different mess that we don't want to get into. But at the same time, I think, yeah, I definitely would say that's a very important goal for organizations to have, to provide a, let's say, a developmental environment and scaffolding for people to grow. And one of the key contributions that I think, or that for myself and for many people that I've talked to in the Holacracy community, one thing that they find extremely valuable, and that's a paradox again in a way, because if you read the Holacracy Constitution, there's not a single word in it that kind of mentions human development, right? Because it's squarely looking at organizational development and the needs of the organization and organizational structures, roles, circles, governance, all these kinds of things. And it has very, it's a very stable pattern that one can observe if you talk to practitioners that that have been working in mature practices for a long time, that they all say, well, this has been incredibly valuable for me as a person, and I've never grown as much as a human being as during that time. And of course that might be coincidental, but I think there's for me personally, there's too much evidence that it's just pure coincidence. And I'm wondering what your take is, and how you look at this from the perspective of S3, because I think maybe to make it a bit more clear also, or to make the question a bit more succinct, I think this in Holacracy, you have this, you're adopting this framework, this set of patterns that is kind of non-negotiable. Well, that's the collection of patterns that we're going to commit to now, right? And basically, in every organization that we're working with, in the beginning, this feels unnatural. It feels challenging. It feels overwhelming for quite a few people in the beginning, right? Because it's not something that we're used to. It's a completely new way of working together, of talking together, of showing up at work, and it puts us squarely out of our comfort zone. For most people, it does that, right? And what also happens if you have the proper support systems in place, people very quickly adapt to it and grow into it, and learn to appreciate the benefits that it brings to their daily experiences at work. But you kind of have to go through this initial phase of pain, in a way, of growth pain, right? And I'm always wondering, and again, there's this delicate balance of it not becoming oppressive and too overwhelming for people. But I think if you just leave it to people's choice, like in the way, like, okay, you can just pick and choose. Very often what I've seen in many organizations who went down that path, you don't get to the point where you actually have this crucial set of practices that kind of nudges you across this boundary, that takes you out of the comfort zone, gets you into the learning zone, and helps you kind of let go of your old ego in a way, and opens you up for something new to emerge, right? And that's one of the things that I've been wondering, like how do you look at that from an S3 perspective, or just generally? I mean, I don't want to reduce you and your perspective to anything, everything has to be through the S3 lens, but I'd be curious.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I appreciate how you laid out the topic here. And you were saying at some point, I don't know if that's coincidental or not, it's like kind of confirmation bias. I don't think it's coincidental, but I think it's not unusual that in introducing constraints that redirect people's behavior in certain ways facilitates self-reflection and the potential for greater consciousness. So at the interface between the habitual and the new, a potential for greater consciousness resides. This is a phrase I share in the context of S3 as well. If we take a single pattern from S3, that's, so on the one hand, many of the patterns will govern people's behavior, but the intent of the pattern is it enables more effectiveness, right? And because S3 is a pull system for change, then people pull in a pattern according to the fact they've identified an area of need, an organizational driver they think it would respond to. And through volition, they choose then to constrain themselves with the pattern. And regardless of whether or not the pattern turns out to be exactly right for them or relevant at all, one inevitable outcome is that they will become more conscious of their habitual way of doing things previously, simply by virtue of the fact it will be contrasted by this alternative way of doing things instead. And because people generally look towards alternatives to their habitual ways of doing things in a time when they recognize need, there's some degree of stress or anxiety or excitement around the possibility of what this new thing could bring. And why I'm saying that is that the more vulnerable we are, the more inclined we are to fall back on our habitual ways of doing things. So individually and as an organization as a whole, if we're looking for new ways of doing things, other than just for the hell of doing it, right, then there's usually going to be some underlying need, and there's going to be some vulnerability around that. And so when you install these constraints, it's going to wake people up, right? You're going to become more alert, because like, I'm just about to do what I habitually do, only wait, it's not my turn to speak in the round, for example. Yeah. Or I have to actually present an argument that makes sense. I can't just blah, right, and use my rank anymore. So these moments of kind of meeting boundaries, awaken people. And so I think what you're observing here is that Holacracy has a whole bunch of constraints that it installs into a system. And so people become more conscious of themselves. Well, they become more aware, at least, right? More awareness is a precursor to consciousness. And I see consciousness as just expanding self, right? Projecting less externally and recognizing more of what we are somehow. But that aside, my point is that, people inevitably become more self-aware. And so that provides a fertile basis for people to then make more conscious choices, sometimes just a conscious choice instead of a habitual one that's not really thought through. It's just based on conclusions and assumptions from many years past and projections onto the now. So people just wake up for a while, they're just paying more attention internally and externally. That's a great set of conditions for people to have the opportunity to grow. And when it's happening in the context of shared objectives that are important, then of course people are going to think more consciously about how they behave. So the same with S3, with a single pattern, the same with Holacracy, the same with Scrum or any other kind of constraint that people bring in. Maybe one other area we should talk about is like choice. So, S3 patterns are for people who want to improve their collaboration. Holacracy, you can make people use S3 patterns, and you can make people use Holacracy, right? And that's happened, certainly in the case of Holacracy, quite famously, I think, in different contexts. But on the other side, you've got examples of groups of people who said, we want to do this, we want to play by these rules, we want to constrain ourselves in this way. And those are the people who generally get better outcomes from it, I think, in the short term at least. So then we're like looking at a bit of a there's an interesting polarity here. Besides the the imperative to use something versus the choice to use something, and the conversations around which is more appropriate when and where is one entirely inappropriate always, and we should look at that, or do both have value in different cases? I think there's a nuance there. I think but there's both. It depends, is an answer there. But the other thing is around rules that lead to consciousness versus choices that lead to constraints based on understanding. So rules that lead to experiences that lead to understanding, or understanding that leads to the creation of constraints that enable something to happen. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Bernard wrote in 2015, it's pretty low resolution. I'm going to read it out to you. He wrote a brief article following a conference when someone asked what's the difference between holacracy and S3. I haven't thought it through enough to know if it's like fully true, but it makes a point. So he said, holacracy creates a system based on a constitution and a body of rules to make it easy for people to be efficient within that system. The emphasis is on structure and autonomy. Alignment is towards purpose. The metaphors used are mostly technical, mechanical. With Sociocracy 3.0, we focus on evolving a culture of effective collaboration aligned towards shared values and shared motivation. The metaphors we use to teach come from organic and human systems because ultimately that's what organizations are. Supporting each other in creating and living a strong culture significantly reduces our dependency on structure and rules, although we cannot do without them, and helps each other develop both personal integrity and autonomy. Mm-hmm. The advantage of holacracy is just what you were laying out. It gives a rule book. It gives really clear constraints that can lead to people coming to appreciate those constraints, and maybe over time lead people to a deeper understanding where they can start to adjust those rules, based on what they learn. S3, on the other hand, whilst each individual pattern provides a small set of rules or guidelines, at least, people need to understand what the patterns are, why they're relevant, and they need to understand how to kind of use them in an effective way, because they just don't go into adequate sort of detail. They're not nailed down as tight as the rules in holacracy. Mm-hmm. And so does that then necessitate greater understanding from people before they can interact with these things in an effective way, before they can recognize what they've got and realize why it's useful? So in those moments of pressure, when there's less imperative to stay with it, they don't just revert back to those habitual ways of doing things, right? That's definitely a problem there, that you're laying out. Mm-hmm. So holacracy promises to solve that by just saying, you can't sway, it's like, it's nailed down, you're in there, and that's what's going to happen. And so when you want to get out, you're going to hit the sides and you're going to learn from that experience. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think it has utility, but there's a whole conversation here about flexibility, adaptability, volition, mm-hmm. How people interact with things that they feel that they don't understand, you get my point. It's like it's a complex area we're jumping into here. I think there's a number of issues that we could unpack within this field.
Yeah. Totally, and I think there are many very valuable points that you've just made that we could dive a lot deeper into. I would totally agree that basically getting people on board on a very basic fundamental level. Okay, this is. When we're starting to work with an organization, one of the first things we do is, well, okay. So for the people who are approaching us, usually those are the owners or the senior management executive team. And the first question we ask them is like, okay, in your fantasy, how is the holacracy practice helping you address business needs, right? Because after all, it's a means to an end. We're not suggesting to do this purely out of ideological reasons, right? If it doesn't serve the purpose of the company, then don't do it, right? Very, very simply. and then and the second question is like, what would how do you want to bring your people on board? Like what's in it for everybody? Like how is this better than what you have currently, right? And what's the story of how this is better for everybody? Like how does this help everybody in your team, in your organization, do a better job, do the best, the best job they can possibly do, right? Bring their full potential to work. And I think, and of course, that's not laid out in the Holacracy constitution that we should do that. You could say that's just common sense, right? If you want to kind of win people over to do something new, well, you need to have a convincing argument, right? And of course, there's probably there's scenarios or there's stories around where people have been more or less successful in doing that, right? Also, the thing that I usually point out is, if we always use the example of soccer. You can use any other kind of sport. I mean, the first step is you need to have a team together that agrees to play soccer, right? And then there's a rule book of, okay, this is how we play soccer, right? So there are 2 goals. There are a few lines that limit the playing field. You cannot kick other players' legs. That's a foul, and so on and so forth, right? And then if you start playing, if you look at a bunch of 5-year-olds playing soccer for the first time, it looks like a complete mess, right? It doesn't resemble at all a game of soccer, even though the rules are in place, right? But they're just not, they're not very competent in playing this game yet. And so that's what we always point out to people. Well, okay, look, this is going to be messy. The first couple of weeks, it's going to be messy. You will feel frustrated because it's going to be difficult. You will feel like a beginner, and that's perfectly okay, right? Because we're all beginners if we step into something new. So we try to normalize this frustration and this learning experience, and to say, hey, this is part of the deal. It's great. It's no problem, and you will learn very quickly. And that's also something that I see again and again. It happens in the trainings. It happens in during the first weeks of an organization starting the practice. People very quickly notice how they're getting better, how they understand things, how they make sense of how the pieces are fitting together, how they actually. And that's one of the most gratifying things that I find in my work. Witnessing these light bulb moments with people, if they recognize for themselves how this is kind of transforming something that they have struggled with for maybe years. So attention that they have felt and set, and carried with them for years, but couldn't properly process, right? How they are suddenly capable of doing that, how they see a pathway that allows them to take ownership, to lead, to make a change in the organization, but in a way that's also supporting them, so that it's not, that they get this double checking of all the other circle members. Well, is this safe enough, or should we maybe make some changes to this proposal, because if we do it like this this might actually cause some harm, right? So I have this support and this kind of the wisdom of the crowd that supports me in leading my piece of the organization. And I find that that's one of the most powerful things to witness, if people really recognize this, right? And then of course there's a whole bunch of other challenges that comes after that, how to deal with this newfound power that you have, right? Being empowered also brings a lot of responsibility, and then you have the first really difficult decision to make, where there's, no matter how you make the decision, you will find yourself with a new set of problems, or some people liking it and other people not, and those are things that that are just naturally evolve from that, and that help us grow further. And that are never really finished. I mean, that's also the thing. I think many people, one of the challenges that we always face in the beginning is, and I think that's actually one of the advantages of S3 is it's very it's much less prone to kind of lead people to believe that there's like a technical ready-made solution for them, right? Because it's not packaged as such, right? And very often in Holacracy, what we find ourselves with is that people think it's a technical solution. Basically, they see transforming the organization as a technical challenge. You just put in some structures and processes, and then that's done and it's over with, right? Right? And what's his name again? I forget the name of the guy who wrote this book. It's called Adaptive Leadership, the book, and he makes this very useful distinction between technical challenges and adaptive challenges. And I think, you know, transforming an organization towards self-management is definitely an adaptive challenge. You have to become a different person in order to play this game well, right? And that's what most people, what they don't see in the beginning, right? And I can understand it. I mean, I definitely for sure didn't see all the ins and outs and all the things that I would have to work through personally to become better at becoming a better, well, organizational steward, right? For the purpose of this organization. So that definitely, it's understandable, and it's one of the traps that I think is stronger with Holacracy, because it provides let's say a neater projection space for people to project this idea upon, that, well, okay, if we're just gonna adopt this Holacracy thing, then, you know, we're all good. It's done.
Yeah. Well, I guess you could make this argument for anything, right? It's coming back to the fact that when you install constraints, it's going to lead to outcomes somehow. And in a way, there's a commonality between implementing Holacracy, which is like a pattern of patterns, versus a small pattern, you know, that's much less significant in relation to S3. I think a question that I have, and there's so many, I realize the more we talk, the more I could keep talking. I think I could talk to you about these things for days, because there's so much in what we're unpacking. Mm-hmm. But a conversation I haven't published yet, I have with John Bunch from Zappos. Mm-hmm. I've known John for a few years now. I've had some involvement with Zappos over the years, and know a bit about their story there. I think Zappos came to notoriety for its Holacracy implementation, and Tony Hsieh's decision to bring Holacracy into the whole system, despite the fact there were some in the system who at the time indicated that that wasn't a direction that they wanted to go in. And it kicked off a whole inquiry around forced implementation and all of these things, you know, and in general, like in a broader sense, like agile transformations and senior management making decisions of how people are now going to do things, and the statistical likelihood of failure in terms of agile transformations, I think, these days, and the whole question of whether that kind of approach is useful at all. But let's lean to the side of, or acknowledge the fact that a group of people throughout a whole organization could choose to play the game of Holacracy. Mm-hmm. But a question I have is, what's the value versus what's the waste? And if the reason I bring Zappos in is, so Zappos today still has people in the organization who use certain practices from Holacracy. Mm-hmm. But there's many places in the organization where those practices aren't alive much at all, right? Most people still know some of the terminology. There's a mental model there, you know, there's some language. Mm-hmm. And recently, you know, Tony Hsieh left Zappos, and then unfortunately recently passed away as well. But you know, there's new management there now, and things I'm sure will change. But over the years, well, Tony explained that, and in his like official letter introducing the fact that they were going to pivot to holacracy across the whole system. He even said there, we see holacracy as a stepping stone towards self-management in this organization, not the end in itself. And there was an enormous investment in the majority of people learning about holacracy. Most people received some days of training, so out of the 1,800 people that were there. And at the end of the day now, when I speak to John, for example, or when I spoke to Tony in the past, they both, I don't know Tony well, by the way, but I've met him. They both explained that for them, they think it was the right move to make because holacracy just kind of kicked them in another direction. And there were so many habitual ways of doing things there that weren't so useful. And so by putting in place those constraints, it woke lots of people up in lots of different ways. It gave people a new frame of reference to think about so that they could make some more conscious decisions about how to proceed. But over time, what's happened is they've developed their own kind of Zapponian way, right? Which has elements of holacracy more or less in different places. And they've also looked outside of that for, like John was explaining about some of the patterns for peer development in S3. We're talking about how people develop. Well, the peer review, for example, was a pattern that they introduced into Zappos because it was just useful for helping individuals and teams have conversations to support them to learn and develop and so on. So it's an example for me of an organization that over time, even though it starts with the whole system, over time, it adapts things, it throws things out that don't seem relevant. There's a different kind of distribution of adoption or retention throughout different parts of the organization. And in time, it kind of weaves in and synergizes with everything else that's happening to kind of reflect their own bespoke way. So is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I think that's the wrong conversation. But on balance, like, is it worth the level of investment? Were the gains from that particular trajectory higher than the costs? Would taking a more pattern-based approach to change, where you're more dependent on people coming to patterns in their own time? How do you support people to learn about those different patterns? And how do you support people to stay true to patterns when they can help, but when they're under stress and they're strongly inclined to fall back on their habitual ways of doing things? These sorts of issues are all relevant in determining what might be a more or less like valuable way for people to go. But I guess my point is that at some point, sooner or later, in most cases, most of the time, I suspect that organizations will go very much the way of Zappos, apart from a few, who stay true to holacracy and kind of have it by the book, so to speak. But the majority do just what they did with the Sociocratic circle method and other methods besides as well. And I think that's probably as it should be. So then if there's any question in that, it's like holacracy is recently leaning towards a more modular approach. Our prediction back in 2015 when we started with S3 was that holacracy would end up looking like S3. Like sets of patterns and then modules of patterns that go together with arguments why they're useful and people can pull them in. I think it's definitely heading in that direction. But then this question, when is it more worthwhile to make that big invest for a whole system implementation and all that entails versus when is it best to take a more pattern-based approach where you pull in patterns precisely for areas of greatest need and take a more iterative and incremental approach to how you evolve the organization? Don't have an answer to that, but I think it's an important question for people to ask. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Yeah, so for me, this whole like the modularization of the Holacracy constitution in version 5, that's definitely a very interesting development. Also, that's I would say it has been a controversial development within the Holacracy community, and I still don't hold a strong opinion if I like it or if I dislike it. I think it's a very interesting development, and it addresses one of the core critiques that Holacracy has received over the years, that it's too big of a change to kind of to swallow in one piece. And I think this is also, this kind of gives a hint towards the question you asked. When is it good? When does it make sense to, you know, to go all in and adopt the Constitution as one piece, and when does it make sense to go for a more pattern-based approach or a modular approach? I would say my current the way I currently look at it is, if I have a critical mass of leaders in the organization who kind of who can grasp the benefits of having this rule book in place, that we can all commit to, right? To have this shared practice, or well, this description of how this practice could work, and to have these boundaries as you described them. I think then I would almost always recommend, okay, let's just go and do it. Just start and learn by doing, right? And when you have well, hesitation, when you have doubt, when you have people saying, well, I really like the concept of you know, circles and roles, but well, kind of really having every circle kind of, you know, having their own governance process, that's a bit I don't know, I'm not sure if I like that. I'm not sure if I can let go of really, you know, big pieces of the organizations governing themselves. And then I would say, well, okay, then just go ahead and start with you know, module 1 of the Constitution. And my current guess is that if you can stop there, right? And you might get a lot of benefit from just that, right? My assumption is that it will not get you past this boundary where you, the way I look at it is like this, almost like this phase shift, right? Where you basically you jump to a new level of development as an organization, where the organization, it suddenly shows like some completely new characteristics and competencies that it didn't have at the lower level, right? And if that's the goal that you're aiming for, right? If you say, well, okay, if we're not developing some really new capacities as an organization, if that's what we need to in order to thrive and in order to express our purpose in the world and serve our clients and, you know, whatever it is, then we need to do that. And then I would recommend, well, okay, then go all in, because it really creates this condition where, like you said, people need to grow into something new. It creates this stress condition that I think if you look, what I always try to do is I look at my own experience and the experience of other people in their own personal journey, right? When you ask people like, what were the times in your life when you really grew as a person? Most of the times, for most people, it's when it was a time of adversity in a way. It was a time of stress. It was a time of challenge. It was a moment in somebody's life journey where they realized, okay, like you said, right, my habitual ways of being will not get me past this challenge that I'm facing now, right? I have to become another person. I have to learn new ways of being. I have to develop new ways of seeing the world in order to be able to get past that, right? And of course, like in life, sometimes we succeed and we grow and we become a better person. And sometimes it's too much for us. The challenge is too big. If we don't have the necessary support system in place, or if it's just too overwhelming, right? And so for me, the question that I'm always wondering, that I'm asking myself, or what basically is the core thing that we're trying to solve in our work is, how can we basically create enough stress in a positive way, enough an impulse for change that's strong enough to kind of nudges us out of this habitual way of being, and at the same time provide a scaffolding and support system that doesn't make this overwhelming, right? There's this Russian developmental psychologist Vygotsky, and he calls this the zone of proximal development, right? Where you're still able to learn something new, but you need a supportive system for that to work. And then there's clearly a zone of overwhelm when even having a teacher or a coach or an external support structure of any sort doesn't help you. It's just too much, right? And of course we want to avoid that, because then no learning happens, and it's even possible that the trauma can occur, which of course we want to prevent by all means, right? We don't want that. But at the same time, if the impulse for change is not big enough, then nothing really happens. You're just basically, you're maybe making some small adaptations to your habitual ways of being, but let's say the foundational story of who you are and how you are in the world and all of that just stays the same, right? It becomes integrated. This new habitual change becomes integrated and assimilated in your existing life story, and that's, in some cases that's enough, but in some cases it's not, right? And so for me, it's always also a way of how well do you really need to have this transformative, as an organization, is this transformative change what you're looking for, or is it just like incremental change and that's already good enough for what you're trying to achieve now, right? And we are, as a company, we're trying to position ourselves very clearly to help organizations that really want to go for this full transformation, not because the other thing is not absolutely valuable and useful, totally, it's just there's a whole different, let's say, skill set and business model behind these two approaches, and also something we've found through experience over the last 8 years, of how this is a very different piece of work to kind of, help people and organizations go through this incremental change and help them go through this, this more deep transformational change, which is kind of, compacted in a way.
Okay, there's a few different things jump out at me from here. One of them is just briefly, like, over the duration of time now where you've been supporting organizations with a whole system implementation of Holacracy, like, if I ask you the same question as Bernard asked me, how many of those over time kind of stay with that? Out of all the people you work with, do the majority of them continue running on Holacracy, as a whole system approach, or what happens there?
Yeah, actually, yes. Actually, a large percentage of the organizations that we have worked with over the last couple of years are still practicing Holacracy, and of course, they have evolved their practice in a way that they have built on top of what Holacracy provides, right? So and that's also an important point to make. I think Holacracy is it provides a nucleus of a practice, like you said, a pattern of patterns, right? That help you kind of develop these new capacities as an organization. It doesn't claim that, it will, and that's very often also, I think, a problem. Some people see it as the silver bullet and as, the miracle, the cure-all. And of course, it can only fall short of this expectation. And nobody in the Holacracy community would make this claim that it's a silver bullet. It addresses a very clear and concise problem space, not a problem space, but it addresses a very particular dimension of organizational reality, right? And I think it's very good at that, and it leaves many things open. And I would say I'm very happy that it does, because I wouldn't want Holacracy to kind of define common patterns or common rules of, for example, that fall more into the cultural space of how we show up as human beings, how we interact with each other as human beings when we're, just having fun, or, talking about our hobbies or things that are important to us, outside of work. I wouldn't want the organization to encroach into this space, right? And of course, many organizations they arrive at the point where they realize, okay, well, we would like to have a better way of, for example, working through conflicts, right? Or to celebrate our achievements, or to just have fun together as a group, because I genuinely like the group of people that I'm working with, and I just want to have fun experiences with them. And so they come up with rituals and also structures and processes to kind of support that. And that's not addressed by the Holacracy Constitution. And we always encourage organizations, to do that, and to build upon this foundational element that Holacracy provides. For me, it's really like it's like the foundation of a house. Of course, the foundation alone, it doesn't help you do much. Or the example we commonly use is also that of an operating system with a computer, which has it's a double-sided sword, because it kind of puts us in this technical meme again, which I think it doesn't really resonate with my experience, but it's something that we regularly hear. But to use it for this question, if you just have a computer with an operating system in place, it's not very useful. It's like the default apps installed in a new MacBook. They're kind of, well, they don't get you very far. If you want to get anything meaningful done, you need to install your own apps. You need to create your own workflows of how you work with, how you put the different apps together, and so on and so forth. And that's something that each organization has to do individually. And I think it's very good that that's the case, because every organization is unique in some aspects. And I think that's also an interesting point, right? Very often in the early stages, organizations are unique to a certain degree, but they're also not so unique as very often they think, right? So some of the things that an organization needs are pretty universal, right? You need to kind of structure work around a shared goal. You need to have a shared understanding of how you make decisions, and so on and so forth. So there are some very universal problems to solve for human organizations to work. And I think what Holacracy tries to do is, we already touched upon that in the first conversation, I think, to provide a minimally viable set of organizational patterns and structures and processes to address that, right? And then based on that, on top of that, there's a plethora of useful things to add. And I mean, that's actually something that I really like about S3, because it adds to that. You can, and not only that, and I would like to use this as a segue for a next question, maybe, because when I look at the map of patterns in S3, what jumped out at me in the last couple of days, for me, it's like an exploded view of Holacracy and beyond Holacracy, right? It's like you have these cool pictures on the internet sometimes where you see like a car engine in an exploded view, where you have all the pieces laid out in a huge space, and it looks really cool, right? And so for me, the way the question that came to me is like, well, is S3 maybe something like an exploded view of self-management in general? And that's super useful to have, because it helps me if I can look at each individual piece and really understand, well, how is this piece constructed? You know, what is it made of? What's its function within the whole? This helps me much better understand the whole, and it leads me to a deeper level of understanding. And I think, and that might be also something for a next round, maybe. I think it would serve almost any holacracy practitioner very well to look at S3 patterns, because definitely helped me better understand holacracy by looking at S3 patterns. At the same time, if I take a car engine, for example, apart, it's not a car engine anymore. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't propel a car, right? It's only if you put a certain amount of pieces together that they have a function. And so I'm wondering, and I think we already slightly touched upon that in this plenary discussion during Teal Around the World conferences. What is this minimal set of pieces that needs to be in place so that you actually have propulsion, right?
Right. So if anyone's wondering if you thought my headphones changed, they did. My battery ran out. So yeah, exploded view of holacracy and much more besides. Sure, that's the point of that was our endeavor, to lift out the patterns we could see making up systems like holacracy and the Sociocratic circle method and Scrum and others. That's exactly what we've done. And I think there's several more patterns that we can put in there as well. The issue of whether, you take all the pieces apart and then you need to put a certain number of pieces together for them to kind of make sense and be useful. I think that's true to a point, and some S3 patterns rely on others. So like driver mapping predicates on understanding many, many patterns in S3. And if you run it end to end, you're probably going to pull in 30 or 40 different patterns actually through that, applying that process pattern. The bigger question here, and there's a couple of hot potatoes I want to pull out of what you were saying. One of them was, you said at some point, generally, if there's a kind of general sense among the leadership of an organization to go for holacracy, then generally that's a good sign for me, and I'd look at going for it. And that ties in a bit back with this question of like whole system implementation, a kind of top-down implementation. Maybe, this is what's happening now, like Tony Hsieh's approach with Zappos. So that's one avenue of inquiry. And then the other one is coming back to the versus a pattern-based approach to change. So a couple of examples to frame what I'm trying to say here. I spoke to Jos de Blok a few times of Buurtzorg, and Buurtzorg and holacracy and a bunch of other things got a kind of good airing through Frederick's book, I think. And Jos's organization, like you said, there's a lot of commonality between organizations, but there's some big differences as well. And so a nurse care provider is very different to a software development company, for example, right? But one thing that stood out for me when I spoke with Jos was he said, when somebody comes to ask me what to do, I ask them, what do you need to be able to work out what you need to do, right? So as a leader, he wasn't telling people anything about what they should do. He was just saying, how can I help you learn better what to do for yourself? That's an interesting approach. It was a bit different to saying, okay, well, what we're going to do is install this, this, and this, and this, and this, right? On the other hand, there are some pretty clear constraints in an organization like Buurtzorg, right? Baked into how the system grew and how the kind of underlying expectations of how people organize and so on there. And Jos is a strong facilitative leader. And the question of what happens when John's gone is a good one. When Jos is gone is a good one, right? What happens to Buurtzorg then? And we can see some of those other examples of organizations, none of which qualify as teal, in my opinion, but in Frederick Laloux's book, that will qualify as what most people would define as teal. When the the leadership changed, the organization changed as well. So this was one thing I think Brian was apparently trying to solve with the Constitution and shifting power to the Constitution. Whether that's legally binding or not is something else. And when the leader goes who endorsed Holacracy, then I think we can see examples in the world today where it would just pivot back anyway, according to the whim of whoever the new leadership are. But the hot potato of if there's a indication from the leadership that they want to go ahead with this, and I think that's a good sign, brings up this whole question of top-down implementation in systems versus a leadership that are facilitating evolution throughout the organization and supporting people by giving them whatever they need to maximally enable them to learn how to operate effectively within the system, both individually and as a part of the whole. I was in a recent conversation with Mira Bangle and Hugo Lopez. They were talking about some of their experiences with Nair Group and K2K, who here in Spain especially, but wider than just Spain as well, have had a lot of successes in facilitating transformations in organizations towards self-organizing systems. Their level of success is extremely high, actually. It's a very top-down approach that they take. One of the constraints they have is that there has to be 80% at least of people throughout that organization who want to and are willing to go ahead with this. Nobody can be fired. This is a precondition of contracting with the company to start with. And the CEO or whoever the leadership is signs an agreement that if they impede the process in any way, they'll be removed and their group will put in their own CEO instead, right? So people seem very, very happy with the outcomes of that. There are some constraints they put in place, but the reason Mira and Hugo are involved there is because they found that introducing people to a number of S3 patterns beforehand gives them useful tools. So when that transformation happens, they can start figuring out how to use those to deal with the new conditions that they face, aka a lot more responsibility for organizational management, basically, locally, and dealing with dependencies across the system as a whole. Daniel Mezek, who's pretty vocal in pushing back on whole system implementations, he was quite critical of what happened at Zappos as one example. He developed something called open space agility, which is like building on the idea of open space. We have a pattern in S3 called open space for change, which is the same kind of principle. He's having enormous success in organizations that wish to transition towards a more agile approach throughout the system, just through running an open space, basically speaking, where anyone who wants to comes. They develop some ideas around how they're going to proceed for the next 100 days, and then they execute on that. And then they have another open space, and anyone who wants comes back, and they review and evaluate and evolve and so on. And he's having a lot of success as well, much more statistically speaking than like these big agile transformations run by these big consulting companies, of which 80%, I think, approximately are failing at the moment. So there's a degree of top-down approach in the Nair Group and K2K, but there's maximal kind of freedom for people to evolve their own unique way within those constraints. I think more than Holacracy, right? Daniel Mezek's approach is even more open than that. It's really down to the people. And it seems that people can work that kind of thing out and do things that are useful and improve the organization. And whilst I hear your argument for Holacracy, it's kind of, it gives a basic kind of framework for people to then build on top all of the things that they need. It's only one way of doing things. Despite its flexibility and openness, it's pretty niche as well. It's based on a quite specific set of fundamental assumptions, and it very much steers people in a particular way in many respects. Ideas around power, role centricity, Just role centricity in and of itself is an enormously defined way of approaching organizational development versus other approaches that you might see in the world. So I guess, I hear all your arguments, and I think that they make sense, and they're relevant, and they stand somehow. But I wanted to invite that bigger picture of, like, there's so many different ways to organize together in the world. And so I'm wondering about, well, Holacracy had a monopoly because it was the only process that Frederick Laloux mentioned. It was the only framework that he mentioned. So everybody kind of jumped on that. It's a bit like Bitcoin, it was like everybody knows Bitcoin, but do you know the other 40 or so cryptocurrencies that are kind of gaining traction in the world? It's like
4,000 probably by now.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm just talking about the ones that have kind of gaining relevance and people are talking about today, So this is where, and maybe this is one of those contentious issues, because what I believe is every context is unique, as you said as well. And whilst I think Holacracy might be relevant to a group of people who seem to be into it and want to do that, one, there's a question of what a kind of top-down implementation of that does to people. That's one avenue of inquiry. But the other one is just, how can you be so sure that Holacracy is like such a good way to start anyway? It's like, is the pattern-based approach to change more viable because it helps you build on exactly what you've got? You don't throw any babies out with the bathwater. You're bringing consciousness to areas of need through the system. You're facilitating people's attentiveness towards that. You're supporting them with whatever they need to deal with it. And you're responding to priorities locally and across the system, and evolving exactly what you had already iteratively and incrementally based on what you learn. Seems to me that in many cases, in the end, Holacracy leads in that direction anyway. And there are many, many cases of where people have pushed back on Holacracy because it was done to them, or it was rejected because in the end it was too limiting and too constraining. Well, I don't have any conclusions around it, Patrick, but I'm kind of trying to weigh up in my own mind if, like, Holacracy didn't just kind of come to notoriety because it was one of the only things that people were aware of. But what I see emerging now are many, many different approaches to organizational development. And ultimately, it seems to me that what's most important is that people are supported in learning how to better learn, how to help themselves. And some elements of Holacracy might be more or less helpful for that in certain contexts some of the time. But generally speaking, what people need in different contexts is quite variable. And some people have got some things down and other things not. And one of the arguments then for a pattern-based approach for change is that it enables people to focus on precisely what they need without the waste of a whole bunch of other stuff that may be more or less well received and more or less relevant.
Yeah, so I think we could easily extend this to another, 2.5 hours. Maybe just one last thought or perspective on this top-down theme, because I think this is really interesting. There's a lot to dissect in there, because I think it's to some it again, it has to do with this phase shift, with this transitioning point. And I think it's a very so in a traditional conventional organization, you have this very clear paternalistic structure in place, right? They're basically the parents and the children, right? They're the people who carry the responsibility, and then there are the people that are to be guided, and in some cases to be dictated and corrected, and all these things. And if you look at parenting, it's the same thing, right? Of course, there are different philosophies to parenting, but well, until your children are of legal age, they 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 well, they have a legal requirements and a responsibility to well to basically take care of their children, right? That doesn't mean they should kind of be coercive or anything like that. The law doesn't suggest that, although it happens sometimes. But then there's this moment in time, this very concise point when you turn 18 in most countries, or 21 in some other countries, where there's like a shift happening. Okay, now we all consider you an adult person, and that has some consequences, right? So now suddenly you alone are responsible for your actions, right? There's nobody shielding you anymore in a legal sense from your own actions, and so on and so forth. And of course, for most people, I would say this very precise point doesn't correspond with their personal experience, right? We most of us in some areas of our life tend to act like children for some more years after this period in time. Some of them already grow up to act in a more adult, mature way before they turn 18 because of their life circumstances. So I think, and the thing that happens is just, and of course that doesn't mean as a parent, that doesn't mean that I stop caring and I stop loving my child or anything like that. It just means there's this threshold that's being passed that has some meaning and has some consequences. And I think when an organization adopts holacracy, it is a very similar act in a way, right? Because we say, well, actually the leaders of this or this organization say, well, okay, hereby I relinquish my personal authority into this set of rules, and the authority and the power resides in those rules now, pretty much like like it resides in the law in the larger society, and this is binding for all of us, right? And now if we go back to the parenting example, I'm pretty sure there are quite a few children that are kind of nudged out of the nest at 18 because it's actually quite comfortable in the nest. It's quite nice to have to be taken care of and to be loved and to be nourished and so on and so forth. And to a certain degree, it's preventing you from fully stepping into your own your full adulthood and becoming your own person, right? And I think that's what's there are many different elements to that, because legally speaking, it's only the senior leadership who can formally take this decision, right? Because they are authorized by law, and they also carry the responsibility to kind of, they're liable if something, even though it's very very seldomly actually it has any legal consequences, even if they do all kinds of shenanigans. But from a legal perspective, they can be held accountable if they make any grave errors, right? And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, right? So very often, if we start working with organizations that where's this notion, well, we just want to empower people and we want to kind of have more say, we always kind of bring in this other perspective and say, well, that's great, and let's definitely go, we're all for that. And there's another piece of the puzzle, there's another side of the coin where, well, there's responsibility to be distributed, right? And to be carried, and this organization to be led. And I think this ratifying the Constitution, it's almost like a rite of passage. It signifies this milestone in an organization's journey that, okay, now there's something has now really shifted. Something is fundamentally different from here on out, and this has consequences, right? And I think this can be a very catalyzing event for an organization. And I think that's one of the powerful things. And we usually recommend our organization, our clients, to also make this into something special, right? To kind of really celebrate this, or to kind of have a ritual in the largest sense in any form or shape or style that suits their culture, but to kind of really to highlight that, well, this is something important that's happening here. This is a major shift, like if we become legally an adult, right? And I think that's something that I'm wondering, that I'm a bit worried about, and also that I observe in practice that's getting lost if organizations start, you know, how should I put it? Well, adopting patterns, or just, you know, developing their own practices. That very often gets lost in the process. And I think, to your point, you know, with the example that you've made with K2K, absolutely, you know, I mean, of course, it's greatly useful. I think it's absolutely useful to have, if you know, if I'm a 16-year-old and I already understand some of the things that will be required of me once I turn 18, that would make my transition to becoming legally an adult much easier, right? I'm better prepared for this step than if I've never heard of it before. So totally, I mean, whatever you can bring in up front before you take this step, I think that's always a plus and a benefit. Also, I would say in most organizations that we've worked with, I would say this 80% rule, even though we haven't formally taken this poll in most organizations, I would say in most organizations we have absolutely reached that threshold. Almost all the organizations that we've worked with, we've encouraged them to really to create space where people also have conversations around this. What does this mean? What will that change? What does that mean to me? Like all these kinds of questions up front, I think they're hugely important to be addressed, right? And I think the more space you create for these kinds of conversations, the easier the transition will be, and the more people will be involved in becoming active agents for the transformation. Yeah, so those are some thoughts on that.
I'm aware of time, Patrick.
Yeah, we're coming up towards the end of our time slot, huh?
Yeah. So I mean, even though I could keep talking about this, I'm sure there might be others, if they're listening in, arriving at a point where they've had enough. We don't quite have the status of Joe Rogan yet to get away with your 4-hour conversations, maybe. One thing I would like to kind of just like close this part of the conversation with, at least, would be, I still see an underlying kind of distinction that's useful to make between patterns you're describing, like having a constitution, you know, shifting power through a contractual agreement among people, or like redistributing power to influence through the system. From holacracy, you know, they're not arguments for holacracy, they're just arguments for these patterns being useful sometimes in certain cases. Mm-hmm. And back to the point I was making about there's been limited options for people to consider. Mm-hmm. And people aren't encouraged necessarily to think so much in terms of a pattern-based approach. And even if they see one, they'll confuse it for being a framework or a method, like I was explaining at the beginning of the call. Mm-hmm. So I'm still kind of staying with that wish to tease these things apart, because your arguments are sound, you know, they make total sense, but they're not arguments for holacracy. They're just arguments for specific elements of holacracy in the context you're describing, having had experience around. And I'm still with the question, you know, when is it worthwhile to invest in holacracy as a whole versus when is it worthwhile to look at specific issues in the organization and specific patterns that can help with that? Answer the question, upon which other patterns does this pattern depend, right? That's important. But having that conversation alongside all the existing patterns in the organization provides more flexibility to kind of evolve a more bespoke way to go from the start. So to be clear, I'm not in any way discounting the fact that for some people, some of the time, holacracy might not be a great way to go, because they want it and it makes sense for them in their context. Fair enough, and then they find out through experience. The same as was my opinion around SCM as well. Mm-hmm. But I believe that in the future, we need to not only develop our capacity for far more nuanced conversations, but we also need to look at how to continually invest in learning and evolving systems, but acknowledging the inherent wisdom that's baked into our previous ways of doing things as well. Mm-hmm. And in many cases, I think there's an argument for being a little less hasty of like grabbing the most obvious or the first kind of whole system approach that seems to make sense, even though it makes sense in the moment, but appreciating the possibility of investing in learning how to take a more iterative and incremental approach to change in the system, including how you manage the system as a whole, and looking to systems of patterns like holacracy, let's say a really contentious one like SAFE, it's like the holy grail of agile transformation, blah de blah. And looking at, well, it's obviously not all crap, right? There's obviously usefulness in there, but SAFE's a great example of where at the end of the day people look back and say, wait a minute, that's like, maybe 10% useful, but 90% horror, right? And in other cases, of course, you got 90% great, love it, and wouldn't have wished to do it any other way. But that's the point, right? Every context is unique. Mm-hmm. And to what level of resolution do we look at things like holacracy, like S3, to see a system in a level of resolution that's most meaningful and relevant to us? Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes it's the big picture. Sometimes we need that exploded view where we can drill in and say, that's that little piece there. That's exactly the thing we need.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's definitely pick that up in maybe a next round, because I think there's a lot of good stuff to unpack and dive deeper into it in all the points that you've just made. So maybe just as a brief and non-committal outlook for some future rounds, what do you think of maybe having as a general framing for some next rounds, really looking at what can holacracy practitioners actually learn from S3 and gain from looking at S3, and vice versa, what can S3 practitioners learn from holacracy? Very much to your point, that I think it doesn't really make sense to pit these two against each other, because they're really just different things that cannot be really compared. But I think they're very much mutually beneficial, and I think both of them would greatly, both practitioners of both approaches, a pattern-based approach and a more framework, holistic-based approach, can significantly improve their practice and understanding by looking at the other. And I would really enjoy, looking at that in more detail, and really, also, I for one would definitely learn a lot and would look forward to learning a lot more details about S3. And I'm pretty sure from the holacracy community's perspective, many people might enjoy that.
Let's do it. Sounds good.
All right.
Thanks a lot for your time, Patrick.
Thank you a lot. It was a great pleasure again, and a very stimulating simulation conversation.
We didn't make anything up, guys. It's totally spontaneous.
And I'm looking forward to the next round.
Yeah, sure. Me too, Patrick. Thanks. I've appreciated every conversation we've had, and this one is no exception. And look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Great.